After the American Revolution, the relatively new country had to deal with a number of issues following its independence, as it was a relatively weak country, seeking to find its place in the world stage. Although the War of 1812 demonstrated America's military capabilities, it was the result of America's earlier experiences in previous conflicts, the first of which is the XYZ affair, or the Quasi War, in which the US fought an undeclared naval war against France. You may be asking, how did two countries who were allies a decade earlier are now at odds with each other? Well, it all starts with a treaty. Well, two treaties actually. The origins of the Quasi War dates back to the American Revolution. Although America had declared its independence, the war was going badly for the Americans, as following the capture of New York by the British, the US Army was forced to retreat at Valley Forge, in which many troops died of disease or frostbite. Even if the US gets out of the situation, if the war continues, eventually the US will drain all of its resources, whereas the British can recover from their losses easily and fight another day. To solve this, Benjamin Franklin set sail for France in search for military aid. It took some convincing, but using his big brain, he was able to convince the king into joining the alliance in 1778, which gave the US the much needed aid to win the war. Long story short, the US won the war, gaining the Northwest Territory under the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Fast forward 10 years later, and with France embroiled in a revolution, along with its longtime rival taking advantage of the situation, France gazed its eyes on the US, hoping that they will honor the 1778 Treaty of Alliance, as France still considered the treaty to still be in effect. President George Washington, however, was not interested, deciding to unofficially nullify the treaty and declare neutrality. This not only angered France, but also angered members of his own cabinet, as they wanted to strengthen ties between France. What's even worse, the US signed the 1794 Jay Treaty with Britain, and as a result, France started seizing American ships, which in turn unleashed a number of anti-French sentiment within the country, eventually leading to the passing of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is still in effect today. When John Adams was elected as president, he continued the position of neutrality, since he was responsible for Washington's decision in the first place. He hoped that by staying neutral, it will preserve peace between Britain and France, as both countries historically had interest in the US. He tried to ease relations, but the French government refused any negotiations and suspended any commercial ties with the US. With the Federalist Party wanting war, he had to do something. He could either do nothing and continue to alienate his own party, or go to war and allow Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Republican Party to win in the next election. With no choice, he chose the latter, but not officially, as by doing so would give him any plausible deniability of acting in aggression. In May 1798, Congress authorized the seizure of French raiders that were operating near the American coast, and allowed merchantmen to arm themselves for self-defense. Before any operations would be conducted, one main issue the military faced was the lack of a navy. Although 6 large frigates were under construction, they were still far away from completion. This, in addition to an incompetent officer corps, left the ship's crew undisciplined. These factors led to a disproportionate amount of merchant ships seized, and by June 1797, about 316 merchant vessels had been captured, which made up 6% of the US merchant fleet. In preparation, George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the military, allowing the military to have a degree of independence, which resulted in the re-establishment of the Navy and the creation of a new branch, the Marine Corps. With the Navy restructured, the 6 ships currently in construction were authorized to be put into commission immediately. By the fall of 1797, 3 were launched, but were not ready for active service. Desperate for more warships, America set their eyes on private business, who are more than willing to help the US, adding 9 more frigates to its fleet, plus completing the remaining 2. Although small, they are one of the fastest ships the US Navy had in their arsenal, which was a perfect counter against commerce raiding. To protect America's territorial waters, about 10 galleys were put into service. We cannot forget that merchantmen also played a role in the Navy's buildup, as from 1798 through 1801, about 933 ships were armed, typically with light guns. In total, 25 ships plus a large number of armed merchant vessels were at the Navy's disposal at the start of the war. The US Navy's main operations focus on the Caribbean, where they are tasked to escort merchant fleets coming through the West Indies, in addition to providing aid to Haitian rebels in Saint-Domingue. In July 1798, USS Delaware captured French privateer La Coyable off the coast of New Jersey. La Coyable was renamed USS Retaliation, in which in November of that same year was recaptured by the French before being recaptured again a year later. The US would get its first major victory when USS Constellation captured La Sergeante in its first naval engagement. A year later, USS Constellation would engage in a larger ship, La Vengeance, with a draw. Meanwhile, America's merchant fleet was able to hold off on its own against French privateers. This is due to American ships being better armed than their French counterparts, as they rely heavily on manpower for its captures. It's clear to the French that America won't be bullied into submission, and soon sued for peace, signing the Treaty of Montefontana in September 1800. In total, the US Navy captured around 85 ships, with 1 ship lost throughout the entire war. Despite having a small navy, how did the US manage to successfully fend off the French? First is the US's long-time tradition of shipbuilding, which allowed them to build up a naval force much quickly. Second is the French Navy itself. Although having a numerically superior navy, their forces had been stretched too thin after years of fighting with the British. In addition, their crews were poorly trained and undermanned by the war's start. This is due to the situation France is in, as the country was embroiled in revolution, which in the process had purged many of France's best admirals. It does not help that the British had been blockading French ports, which severely limit France's naval capability. Whatever the case, the war shows how important maritime security is. Even if you're an ocean away from the nearest naval power, they can use that advantage against you if they have the chance. Although the war is seen as a footnote in US history, it helped shape America's foreign relations and served as a basis for future conflicts, most notably the War of 1812. Because of this war, the Federalist Party that John Adams was associated with would lose to Thomas Jefferson of the Democratic Republican Party. It's safe to say that in the end, nobody wins, except for Thomas Jefferson.